This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas, doing some very simple beginner machine knitting lessons on a flatbed Japanese machine. And I want to talk about increasing and decreasing. I'm going to show decreasing first, and I'm going to use a transfer tool. I used this before for casting on and for binding off. And what I'm going to do first is the very simplest one-stitch decrease on an edge. You get a stitch transferred onto the transfer tool, and then you put it on the adjacent needle, and you have decreased by one stitch. Same thing on the other side. You transfer the stitch one needle over, and then you have decreased, and you can knit a few rows. You show it again. To use the transfer tool, you put this eye over the hook of the needle, pull towards you, push back, lift up, lay it on the next hook, and then drop the stitch on. Same thing on the other side. So this would be decreasing on both sides of the knitting, on the left and the right ends of the knitting. Now, that's okay, but it's really not the best way to decrease. Normally, you want the last stitch to be the seam in the garment, and you want to do what they call full fashion decreasing, with two of these stick transfers, or even a tool that has three eyes on it. So starting with the two, you pick up two stitches by dropping this in the hook, pulling towards you, pushing back, and then you move over by one needle. And you have to remember, if you still have a needle in work, to push it back. Otherwise, the machine will lay yarn in it and it'll be knitting on it again. So what you have after you've done that is you have one loop in the first hook and you have two loops in the second hook. To do that from the left side, I'm going to pick up these two end stitches. I'm going to move over by one needle, and I'm going to drop them in so that I have one on the end stitch, one on the end needle, I should say, and then I have two on the second needle. And that is a full fashion decrease, and it looks better next to a seam. I'm going to do it once more so that I can show it when I flip the sample over. Now you can do a full fashion decrease also with a three-stitch transfer tool. You can see it isn't much more work to do the full fashion and use the other transfer tool. It really doesn't take any more time than using the one-stitch transfer. So why not do this slightly more attractive decrease? So let me pick up three loops and move them over by one needle. And I can see that I'm running low on stitches to be decreasing. Probably need to start showing increasing pretty soon. And on the left side, same thing. Pick up the three stitches. Oops, I missed one. I could still get it. And move them over by one needle. So I have what I'm going to have after I use this triple transfer tool is I have one stitch here, and two stitches here. Now, as far as increasing goes, the very simplest way to increase is just to bring out a needle on the side where the carriage is. When you knit across, it lays yarn in it, and that will increase. And you can increase very rapidly this way. And I'll bet you're not surprised at all when I tell you that this is not the most attractive increase. It leaves an open loop here on the edge. Sometimes we take advantage of this open loop for certain patterns, because we're doing it intentionally. But it's not the prettiest increase, and it makes it a little bit harder to seam the garment up and have it look great. So let me show some other ways. You could increase just one stitch from the edge by transferring one's needle out. Now, if you had an empty needle, let me show you. That's going to make an eyelet. So if you wanted a hole, if you were doing something lacy, fine. But if you really just want a nice, almost invisible increase, instead you're going to transfer the stitch out. Let me do one on the left. And then, here's one of those situations where I really hope you can see that I'm picking up, they call this the heel of the stitch, but this is the stitch from the row below on the adjacent needle, and I fill in the empty needle with it. So that's a one stitch increase. Now if I want a nice full fashion increase, then I move more stitches out, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, however many stitches out, and then do the increase inside there. So here I will move 3 stitches out. Get that on there. And I have to remember to fill in that empty needle using the heel of the stitch beside it. So there's a full fashion increase on the right. Let me do one on the left, and I'll knit a few rows. And there's one other little trick that I want to show you while I'm thinking about increasing and decreasing. 1, 2, 3, get them all in hooks. And pick up the heel of the stitch beside and fill in the empty needle so that this will be a nearly invisible increase. The last thing that I wanted to show about increasing and decreasing is what I call a double decrease, which is something that I use sometimes for speedy raglan decreases. I'm moving over by 2 stitches. So you see, I now have 2 empty needles here. The first stitch is by itself on this needle, but this needle has 2 stitches, and this needle has 2 stitches, and I actually emptied these 2 stitches, and I'll put them out of work. Let me do the same thing on the left. Move over by 2 whole stitches. Get that latch open. Obviously, you decrease very fast indeed if you're taking 2 off on each side. Now I want to take this off the machine and hold it for the camera and describe each of the things that I just did so that you can see how they look on the stockinette side of the knitting. Okay. I began the swatch with several rows of plain knitting. And then I did some decreases on the very edge. Right here you can see that this stitch, if you look at it vertically, it just runs away to nowhere. And then this stitch runs away to nowhere. It just goes away. This is where I began the full fashion decreases. And you often see these on commercially made sweaters. You see how this stitch tucks under this vertical row, tucks under this, and along the edge there's a stitch, and this is where you would do the seam, is right along this dent. And I did the same thing on both sides so you could see that. These were those simple increases that I said made a loop on the edge, and you can see that the loop isn't the greatest looking increase in the world, but it was very fast. And then here was an increase that made a hole where I just moved a stitch over but didn't fill in the empty spot. And then here's a decrease where I filled in the empty spot. And up here I've done the full fashion increase, And you can see the empty spot filled in way over here, so that the last few stitches don't, they don't bend out at the very edge. They bend out over here more toward the middle. And you can see it on this side too, where that full fashion increase was. And then finally, I did a double decrease. You see these 2 stitches running under? So that was the double decrease on the left and on the right.